Hey guys, tonight we unravel medieval England's most baffling riddles, mysteries that historians still can't quite explain. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's step back to the fateful year of 1066, a year that changed the course of English history. Harold Godwinson, King of England, met his end on the blood-soaked fields of Hastings, facing the Norman invader William of Normandy. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, an arrow struck him. The details remain debated, but the outcome was clear. Harold fell, England was thrown into turmoil, and a king's life ended in the dust of battle. Yet, while Harold's death is well documented, one part of him seems to have vanished: his heart. Medieval chroniclers report that his heart was removed after death, possibly by his devoted brother, Garth, or by his chaplain, Wulfstan. But what happened next is shrouded in mystery. Some claim the heart was interred at Waltham Abbey in Essex, a site deeply connected to Harold's family and spiritual life. Others whisper that it was cast into the sea, a symbolic offering to God or to cleanse it from the dishonor of defeat. This is where the story becomes tantalizingly elusive. No one has definitively located Harold's heart. Waltham Abbey has long been associated with it, yet archaeological searches have turned up nothing conclusive. Ship logs and naval records offer no confirmation of a heart thrown into the waves, and the chroniclers themselves, though detailed in many respects, leave gaps as if the tale of the heart were meant to be as mysterious as the king's final moments. Why would Harold's heart be treated this way? In medieval England, the heart was not merely a physical organ, it was the seat of courage, loyalty, and spiritual essence. To preserve, bury, or hide a king's heart carried immense symbolic weight. Removing it could signify honor, keeping the essence of the king alive in a sacred place, or it could signal secrecy, concealment, or a political act designed to control memory after death. Some historians speculate that the heart was deliberately concealed to prevent it from falling into Norman hands. After all, William's victory was complete, and his forces swept through England with brutal efficiency. The symbolic capture of Harold's heart would have been a powerful statement, a way for the Normans to assert dominance over the fallen king even in death. By hiding or dispersing it, Harold's supporters could protect not just the body but the very symbol of his soul, courage, and kingship. Waltham Abbey, the supposed resting place, adds another layer of intrigue. Harold had been a devout supporter of the abbey, and it is said that he prayed there before Hastings. Placing his heart within its walls would have been both a spiritual act and a political one, affirming loyalty to God and to a community that had long been central to his family. Yet centuries of reconstruction, decay, and historical upheaval have erased tangible evidence. The abbey remains a site of reverence, but the precise location of Harold's heart, if it was ever there, is lost to time. Then there is the theory of the sea burial. Some accounts suggest that the heart may have been cast into the waters off Hastings or along the southern coast, a symbolic gesture connecting the king to England itself. In medieval thought, the sea was a liminal space, a boundary between life and death, between the mortal world and divine judgment. To send a king's heart into the waves could have been a statement about transcendence, martyrdom, or unfulfilled destiny. Yet, if this were the case, why do the chroniclers provide no precise location, no ceremonial details, no witness accounts beyond rumor? The mystery deepens. Adding to the puzzle are conflicting medieval sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions Harold's death, but is vague about the treatment of his body. Later chroniclers, including Orderic Vitalis and William of Poitiers, hint at extraordinary care taken with his remains, yet their accounts diverge. Some emphasize burial rites in Waltham, others describe a secretive removal of the heart. These discrepancies may reflect political bias, incomplete information, or the natural human desire to mythologize the final acts of a fallen king. The story of Harold's heart also resonates with broader medieval practices. Kings and nobles often had hearts interred separately from their bodies, particularly in cases where symbolic or religious considerations outweighed logistic. Richard the Lionheart, for example, had his heart embalmed and buried at Rouen, far from his body in chalice. Harold's heart fits into this tradition, yet unlike other examples, his remains have eluded discovery, leaving only tantalizing clues. Could the heart have been hidden to safeguard a legacy? Perhaps Harold's supporters wanted to ensure that, even in defeat, a part of their king survived. Preserving the heart could allow future generations to honor his courage, to maintain a tangible connection to a ruler who had faced overwhelming odds. In a culture where relics of saints and noble figures held spiritual and political power, the heart of a king could serve as both devotion and defiance. But what if the heart's disappearance was more sinister, a deliberate erasure meant to confuse history and obscure memory? Medieval chroniclers often crafted narratives with political purpose. By leaving the fate of Harold's heart uncertain, the story allowed both reverence and ambiguity to coexist. To his supporters, the heart was a sacred relic. To his enemies, it became a phantom, a missing treasure that symbolized what had been lost. The ambiguity itself may have been part of the legacy, a story that endures precisely because it cannot be resolved. Imagine, for a moment, standing in Waltham Abbey, centuries later, sunlight filtering through Gothic windows. You trace your hand over the stone floors, imagining the solemn procession that might have carried a king's heart to its resting place. Or consider the cliffs and waves along the southern coast, where the sea could have claimed the heart in a ceremonial act. The uncertainty, the gaps in historical record, and the whispers of legend all converge to create a narrative that is as much about imagination as it is about fact. And yet, the allure of the mystery persists. Modern historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts have sought to locate Harold's heart, to reconcile legend with evidence. Excavations, historical analysis, and even folklore studies converge on the same conclusion. The heart is lost. Whether it was buried, cast into the sea, or hidden deliberately, no tangible trace remains. Its absence, however, amplifies its significance, inviting speculation, reverence, and storytelling. The mystery of Harold's heart is more than a curiosity. It is a reflection of medieval values, belief systems, and the human desire to preserve legacy. It connects us to a moment of national trauma, to the chaos of battle, and to the symbolic weight of the heart as seat of courage, loyalty, and life itself. The vanished heart embodies both physical absence and cultural presence, a symbol that endures despite centuries of silence. However, what if the heart wasn't lost, but deliberately concealed? Perhaps it waits still in some hidden alcove of Waltham Abbey, or in a secret grave long forgotten, or beneath waves no one dares to search. The heart of Harold, missing yet unforgettable, challenges our assumptions about history, memory, and the stories we inherit. It reminds us that sometimes what is most powerful is not what we see, but what has vanished, echoing across centuries, daring us to wonder, to search, and to imagine. Fast forward roughly a century after Hastings, to the quiet hills and valleys of rural Somerset. England had begun to settle under Norman rule, but the countryside remained a place of deep superstition and devout faith. Villagers lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the church bell, and the priest or preacher was not merely a spiritual guide. He was the bridge between the mortal world and the divine, a man whose voice carried warnings, confessions, and absolution. It was in one of these small, thatched villages that our story unfolds, a story that has perplexed historians and folklorists for centuries. A local preacher, whose name has been lost to time, was laid low by illness. His parishioners tended to him faithfully, expecting that he would pass quietly, as many did in those harsh years. But death, or what appeared to be death, was only the beginning. The preacher died, or so the villagers thought. Preparations for his funeral were made with all the usual rituals: the washing of the body, the dressing in simple robes, the lighting of candles, the chanting of psalms. Word spread throughout the village and neighboring hamlets, and mourners gathered to pay their respect. The coffin, a simple wooden construction, was placed in the churchyard, awaiting the interment that would close the chapter on the preacher's life. Then the unthinkable happened. Witnesses later swore, with trembling voices and pallid faces, that during the service the coffin lid began to shift. At first, only a faint tremor, almost imperceptible. Then a scraping sound like nails on wood echoed across the stone floor. Villagers recoiled, uncertain whether to flee or intervene. And then the coffin burst open. The preacher emerged. Pale and disheveled, he gasped for breath. as if returning from another world entirely. His eyes, wide and unseeing, scanned the faces of his congregation. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. He described visions, a journey through a shadowed realm, a place of fire, chains and souls in torment. He spoke of the dead who could not rest, of angels and demons who argued over the fate of men. The villagers, struck with equal parts awe and terror, could only listen. And then he vanished. Not gradually, like one walking away, but abruptly. One moment he stood there, recounting his journey beyond the veil. The next, he was gone. Panic ensued. Mourners fled. Some fainted, some wept. The priest, or perhaps it was the same preacher, now fully recovered, reappeared days later alive, claiming no memory of leaving the church. Weeks passed. Life returned to the village, and yet the preacher died again. This time the story repeats. At the second funeral, the coffin lid moved on its own. A scraping, a lift, and the preacher once again emerged. He described the afterlife, similar visions, though slightly different, and once more disappeared without a trace. The accounts raise many questions. Was this a case of premature burial, as historians have long speculated? In medieval times, the understanding of death was rudimentary. People were sometimes pronounced dead when in fact they were in deep coma, suffering from illnesses that slowed the pulse and breathing to imperceptible levels. Premature burials were a terrifyingly common occurrence, giving rise to numerous folktales across Europe. Could the preacher have awoken in the coffin, pushed it open, and wandered through the church, only to be found days later by chance? Yet, the repeated nature of this phenomenon complicates that explanation. A second premature burial seems unlikely, unless the man's health remained extraordinarily precarious. Some historians have suggested that these stories may have been exaggerated over time, transformed into legend through oral retelling. But even the earliest chroniclers who wrote down the tale described two separate funerals, two awakenings, a narrative that endures in parish records, folklore compilations, and antiquarian writings. Then there is the uncanny dimension. The preacher's descriptions of the afterlife were vivid, detailed, and horrifying. Images of souls weighed on scales, purgatorial fires, ethereal figures wailing in chains. He recounted these visions not as metaphors but as though he had walked among them. For the villagers, this was not merely a curiosity, it was a warning. They recorded his words, trembling, believing that God or the devil had chosen him as a messenger. Consider the cultural context. Medieval Somerset, like much of England at the time, was steeped in belief in spirits, revenants, and the permeability between life and death. Tales of ghosts, miracles, and omens were accepted as part of everyday life. A preacher returning from death would have been interpreted through these lenses, either divine favor, a cursed soul, or a warning to the living. The tale may also reflect medieval anxiety about death and the afterlife, a period when the plague, famine, and warfare made mortality an ever-present companion. Some modern scholars, however, take a more analytical view. They suggest that the phantom preacher could have been a form of collective hallucination, intensified by grief and religious fervor. In small, isolated communities, psychological phenomena such as sleep paralysis, hypnagogic visions, or mass hysteria could produce seemingly supernatural experiences. The repeated nature of the story may be a narrative device, a moral tale of vigilance, divine power, or the consequences of unprepared souls. Yet the story's survival in parish records and chronicles suggests it was more than mere imagination. Something remarkable occurred. Whether biological, psychological, or truly supernatural is impossible to determine. The preacher's legend became part of the cultural fabric of Somerset, retold for generations as a chilling reminder. Death, in medieval England, was never final until the earth had received you, and sometimes not even then. As we think about the phantom preacher today, one cannot help but shiver at the thought of a coffin lid creaking in a quiet churchyard, the whispered words of someone who should have been gone, yet walked among the living. Did he glimpse the afterlife? Did he cheat death, only to vanish once more? Or was he a victim of circumstance, disease, and misinterpretation, later woven into legend? Whatever the truth, the story, and it leaves us with the unnerving question: when we bury the dead, how certain are we that they truly rest? Was the preacher merely a victim of premature burial, or did he truly journey to realms beyond our understanding, a living messenger returned to warn the living of what awaits in the shadows? Pendle Hill, Lancashire, 1612. The date may place us slightly beyond the medieval period, but the echoes of superstition, folklore, and fear still linger here like mist over the moors. For centuries, locals have whispered that the hill itself is haunted, that its slopes and ridges remember the deeds and cries of those who lived and died under suspicion of dark arts. The story begins in a region gripped by poverty, rigid hierarchy, and religious fervor. Northern England, with its harsh winters and isolated communities, was fertile ground for fear. A failed crop, an outbreak of disease, or an unexplained death could quickly be attributed to the workings of witches. In this climate, rumor and accusation carried real weight. In 1612, 12 people from the area surrounding Pendle Hill, women and men, young and old, were accused of witchcraft. The case would become one of the most famous in English history. They were charged with maleficing, causing harm through supernatural means. The accusations were often absurd by modern standards, cursing neighbors, spoiling crops, or causing cattle to fall ill. Yet for the local magistrates and the people of the time, such charges were deadly serious. The trial at Lancaster Castle became notorious. Eyewitness testimony, often extracted under duress or fear, was the primary evidence. People claimed to have seen the accused meet with the devil, to have witnessed impossible feats, or to have felt cursed after an encounter. Despite the lack of physical proof, 10 of the accused were found guilty and executed by hanging. Others were imprisoned or later released. But the story of Pendle Hill did not end with the hangings. According to witness diaries, letters and folklore collected in the centuries that followed, the cries, moans, and voices of the accused were said to linger on the hill. Some claimed that, at the dead of night, when the wind blew over the slopes just so, one could hear screams, whispered incantations, or eerie laughter echoing across the moors. Locals swore that the hill itself seemed to remember the terror and injustice that had occurred there, that the earth had absorbed the fear, rage, and despair of those who died. The phenomenon became known as the Pendle Witches' Echo. Stories persisted that travelers and shepherds would sometimes hear voices calling their names, or that sheep would scatter as if fleeing an unseen force. Villagers often warned outsiders, "Do not go near the hill at night, or you might hear the cries of the witches and be drawn into their restless shadows." Some historians view these accounts as folklore born from collective trauma. Execution, especially for suspected witches, left lasting impressions on communities. Witnesses might have heard natural sounds, the whistle of wind through heather, the cry of an owl, the rustle of trees, and interpreted them as supernatural because of cultural expectation. Fear has a way of coloring perception. What the brain expects to hear, it often does, especially in dark and lonely places. Yet, the intensity and consistency of reports across decades, sometimes centuries, suggests more than simple misinterpretation. Diaries from the 17th and 18th centuries describe repeated experiences of auditory phenomena, the sound of a woman screaming, a man shouting, or faint chanting echoing across the hill at night. It is as if the events of 1612 had been etched into the landscape itself. Consider also the psychological context. In a community scarred by death, persecution, and hardship, the Pendle Witches' Echo may have served as a form of social memory, a haunting reminder of injustice. Folklore scholars argue that landscapes can hold cultural memory. Hills, forests, and rivers retain stories and fears in the imaginations of those who live near them. For the people of Lancashire, Pendle Hill became a physical embodiment of collective guilt, terror, and fascination with the occult. Some modern interpretations even suggest a quasi-scientific phenomenon. Acoustic anomalies can occur in hilly terrain, where wind, echoes, and temperature inversions carry and distort sound. What may have been ordinary noises could have been transformed into something eerie and inexplicable. Yet, no matter the explanation, the stories endure. The human element is crucial. Witnesses and chroniclers describe hearing voices calling to them by name, mimicking familiar tones, or issuing warnings. Some accounts even suggest that the voices were accusatory, repeating the phrases allegedly spoken by the accused witches during interrogations. Threats, confessions, and curses. In essence, the echoes were not merely sounds, they were narrative fragments, as though the hill itself remembered the trials and terror. To this day, Pendle Hill draws ghost hunters, folklorists, and curious travelers. At sunset, the summit is quiet, often serene, but locals swear that at certain nights of the year, especially around Samhain or All Hallows Eve, the echoes are stronger. Footsteps seem to appear on paths where no one walks. Whispers rise in the wind. Some claim to have felt a cold hand on their shoulder, or the faint sensation of being followed. The Pendle Witch's echo reminds us of how history, trauma, and imagination intertwine. The echoes are not just auditory, they are moral and psychological. They ask questions that historians cannot answer. What is the boundary between lived experience and cultural memory? How do communities remember suffering, injustice, and fear? Can a landscape itself become haunted, not by spirits alone but by the echoes of human actions? Some scholars argue that the echo is metaphorical, an audible reminder of injustice. Others suggest it is literal, a rare combination of geography and psychology producing a phenomenon that has survived for over 4 centuries. And still others embrace the possibility that the echoes are supernatural, a lingering imprint of the witches' spirits themselves, refusing to be silenced. As we stand in imagination on the slopes of Pendle Hill, we can almost hear the past reaching out, the faint murmur of voices, a scream carried on the wind. The laughter of those accused of crimes they may or may not have committed. We remember that history is not merely written in books but engraved in land, memory and story. Or are they the voices of our own imagination, calling us to confront fear, injustice and the mysteries that refuse to die? Warren Percy, a name whispered in the windswept valleys of the Yorkshire wolds. Today, it is little more than a scattering of stone foundations and crumbling earthworks. But in medieval times it was a thriving community. Homes clustered around a church, barns filled with grain, and a village life that hummed with the rhythms of sowing, harvest, and the seasons. And then, it vanished. No record tells of a siege, a massacre, or a plague sweeping through Warren Percy. The parish registers fall silent, the hearths grew cold, and yet, the village did not crumble into ruin from neglect. Instead, it emptied. People left for reasons that historians and archaeologists continue to debate. Centuries later, archaeological excavations, carried out extensively during the 20th century, reveal clues, but no answers that satisfy completely. Foundations of houses, remnants of walls, pottery shards, and fragments of tools tell us that Warren Percy was once bustling. Graves in the churchyard indicate a community sustained for generations. Yet there is an unsettling pattern. Some skeletons show signs of malnutrition, some were burned or broken posthumously. Scholars argue over what that might mean. Was famine at work, disease, or something more disturbing? One of the more compelling explanations lies in climate and economics. The 14th and 15th centuries were periods of upheaval. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, caused by excessive rain and failed crops, devastated much of northern Europe. Villages dependent on subsistence farming were especially vulnerable. Warren Percy may have suffered repeated crop failures, forcing its residents to abandon the land. Economic pressures, such as the shift from arable farming to sheep pastures for the profitable wool trade, could have incentivized landlords to depopulate villages. Land cleared of tenants could be converted to pasture, providing steady income with fewer risks. Yet even these rational explanations cannot fully account for the village's eerie emptiness. Some of the skeletal evidence suggests deliberate acts of violence, bones scorched, skulls fractured. It is as if someone feared the dead would rise, or wished to erase the presence of those who once lived there. Medieval England, after all, was a place of superstition. Tales of revenants, restless spirits, and curses were common. Could fear have driven people to destroy their own dead? Or perhaps it was ritual, or panic in the wake of an unknown threat. Warren Percy is also remarkable for what it preserves, the story of everyday life in medieval England. Excavations show the layout of cottages, the central church, and even the alignment of fields for crops and livestock. Objects recovered, pottery, knives, spindle whorls, and fragments of shoes, give a vivid picture of domestic life. For a historian, it is a treasure trove. For the imagination, it is haunted. One can picture villagers tending sheep, children running along the paths, fires burning in the hearths, all before the silence. There is another layer to the mystery, the timeline of abandonment. It does not appear to have been instantaneous. Archaeological evidence suggests a gradual depopulation over decades, possibly even a century. Perhaps families left in search of better land, marrying into other communities, or following economic opportunities elsewhere. Perhaps young men were drawn to towns or cities, leaving behind aging relatives who eventually passed away. And yet, the pattern is uneven. Some houses show signs of hurried departure, others were simply left intact, as though the occupants stepped away briefly and never returned. The church, often the heart of a medieval village, tells its own story. Warren Percy's church was rebuilt multiple times, indicating a once prosperous parish. Graves and burials suggest continuity, yet there are anomalies. Certain skeletons were placed haphazardly, others deliberately burned. Scholars speculate, were these victims of ritual violence, superstition, or perhaps disease, so poorly understood that it provoked terror? Some folklorists suggest that Warren Percy's emptiness became a kind of legend in itself. A village that simply disappears is unsettling. It invites stories, whispers, and speculation. Villagers in surrounding areas would have spoken of it in hushed tones. The village where no one lives, the land that rejected its people. Over time, Warren Percy transformed from a place to a symbol of the fragility of life, the power of economic change, and the lingering shadows of superstition. Even today, the site carries an aura of mystery. Walk among the ruins at dawn or dusk, and the mind fills in the shapes of people long gone. You might imagine children running across the empty fields, the clatter of livestock, or a smoke trail rising from a long extinguished hearth. The wind through the remaining stone walls produces a hollow echo, almost like whispers from the past. Archaeologists, historians, and curious travelers alike speak of a peculiar atmosphere, a sense that the village, though empty, is still present in some spectral form. And so we return to the central question: why did Warren Percy vanish? Was it the inexorable forces of climate change, famine, and shifting economic structures? Was it superstition, fear, or ritual violence? Or was it something else, a combination of factors, each one subtle, yet cumulatively powerful enough to depopulate a thriving community? No record survives that can tell us definitively. The village itself has become the witness, the stones and soil holding what texts cannot. Warren Percy is a reminder of the vulnerability of human settlements. Even communities that seem permanent, resilient, and prosperous can over time fade into silence. The reasons may be practical, terrifying, or mundane, or some mixture that we may never fully grasp. And in its silence, it challenges us to consider the fragility of our own societies, the persistence of history, and the ways in which memory and evidence intertwine to leave stories for those who follow. Warren Percy may have disappeared physically, but it has never left us. In every broken wall, every scattered stone, and every hollow hearth, the village whispers of a past that refuses to fully rest, a mystery that remains unsolved, even after centuries of digging, theorizing, and imagining. Now we travel to Suffolk, to the village of Woolpit in the later 12th century, a place of rolling fields and sunken pits from which the village takes its name. Here, a story emerges so strange, so extraordinary, that it has baffled historians and folklorists for centuries: the tale of the Green Children. According to chronicles written by Ralph of Coggeshall and later by William of Newburgh, villagers discovered two children, a boy and a girl, wandering near the wolf pits at dusk. They were unlike any children anyone had seen. Their skin was tinged green, their hair oddly colored, their eyes wide with fear. They spoke no English and seemed disoriented in the light of day, as if emerging from a place entirely different from our own. The villagers tried to feed them. At first, the children would eat only raw beans. They refused bread, milk, or meat. Slowly, over weeks, their diet broadened. Their green skin faded and they began to speak the local language. The girl eventually survived and integrated into English society, while the boy died, the chroniclers claim, perhaps from the shock of transition to the surface world. The story raises innumerable questions. Who were these children? Where did they come from? And why did their skin bear the unnatural hue of green? Scholars have proposed a range of explanations, from the mundane to the fantastical. Some suggest the green color was a symptom of malnutrition, a condition known as chlorosis, or green sickness, caused by iron deficiency. In this theory, the children may have been isolated or trapped underground, consuming a limited diet that left them weak, ill, and with a pallid green complexion. Yet other aspects of the story defy simple medical explanation. The children claimed to come from a twilight land beneath the earth, a world without sun. They described a strange place where the light was dim and colors muted, where the air was different and life unfamiliar. To the villagers, this may have sounded like madness, exaggeration, or fanciful imagination. To modern readers, it raises the tantalizing possibility of lost folklore, memory of a subterranean or hidden society, or even a literal journey into isolation that became mythologized. The Green Children story has fascinated historians because of its specificity. Ralph of Coggeshall's chronicle provides names, details of how the children were discovered, and descriptions of their integration into society. It is not a passing rumor or hearsay, it is recorded as an event worthy of attention, unusual though it may have seemed. William of Newburgh, writing decades later, corroborates many details, suggesting that the story had a lasting presence in local memory. Some folklorists see the tale as a fusion of legend and historical memory. England in the 12th century was a land of superstition. Tales of elves, fairies, and hidden realms were common. The children may have been the subjects of such folklore, their unusual appearance amplified by the cultural imagination of the time. Other scholars have proposed that the children were Flemish immigrants or displaced peasants, unfamiliar with the local language and diet, whose greenish skin and confusion inspired a story that became legendary. Yet there remains something hauntingly uncanny about the Green Children. The very act of surviving underground or in isolation for extended periods would have been remarkable. To emerge into a bright, unfamiliar world, to adapt and to communicate, these are human feats that, when coupled with the mystery of the green hue, make the tale unforgettable. And the death of the boy so soon after integration adds a shadow of tragedy, as though the threshold between worlds was too great a burden for some to bear. The story also carries moral and symbolic undertones. Some historians suggest it may reflect medieval anxieties about outsiders, the unknown, and boundaries between communities. The children's strangeness and eventual assimilation of the girl may symbolize the tension between fear of the unfamiliar and the potential for acceptance. Others read the tale as an allegory for the consequences of isolation, neglect, or the fragility of human life in an unforgiving landscape. What makes Woolpit extraordinary is that the tale leaves traces in the landscape itself. The village sits near pits from which chalk was extracted, deep, shadowed depressions that could easily have captured wandering children or animals. One can almost imagine the girl and boy emerging from the pits at twilight, tentative, frightened, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. The physicality of the site adds weight to the story. Unlike many medieval legends, it is rooted in real geography, giving the narrative a tactile, eerie resonance. Consider the psychological experience of the villagers. They witnessed children unlike any they had ever seen, green-skinned, silent, and frightened. They attempted to nurture, to feed, to understand. In doing so, they became part of the story. Generations later, historians and storytellers would recount Woolpit as a place where the bar between normal life and the mysterious was porous, where the extraordinary could intrude into the ordinary. The Green Children also leave us with questions about memory and perception. Were they truly from another world, a lost subterranean community, or simply children displaced by famine, migration, or accident, whose unusual appearance and behavior became magnified into legend? The chroniclers provide evidence, but their perspectives are filtered through time, cultural expectation, and perhaps moral lesson. And yet, for all the explanations offered, the story continues to captivate. There is a haunting resonance to the idea of children emerging from darkness, of a girl surviving where a boy did not, of a world beneath the earth parallel to our own, just out of reach. Woolpit becomes more than a village. It becomes a threshold, a reminder that history is not only about kings and battles, but about the small, fragile lives that flicker briefly, then vanish, sometimes leaving traces that refuse to be forgotten. The Green Children may have come from a twilight realm, from deep isolation, or from some corner of imagination made real. But they remind us that even in the most ordinary villages, the extraordinary can emerge, leaving questions, wonder, and a mystery that refuses to die. Across medieval Europe, tales persist of dancing plagues, outbreaks of uncontrollable movement, where entire communities allegedly danced themselves into collapse, sometimes death. Strasbourg, Aachen, and Maastricht are famous examples from the 14th and 15th centuries. But England, here, the story takes a peculiar turn. Taith. Folklore speaks of villages where men, women, and children were seized by a compulsion to dance. The streets and churchyards would throng with bodies moving in wild, frenetic rhythm, their eyes glazed, muscles taut, sweat streaming. Neighbors supposedly watched in horror as some collapsed from exhaustion, others from sheer terror. Accounts tell of priests attempting to intervene, of parents wringing hands in despair, of communities paralyzed by a force beyond explanation. Yet here's the catch. No credible medieval records exist in England to corroborate such events. There are no chronicles, parish registers, court records, or letters that verify these dancing catastrophes on English soil. So why does the legend persist? Why do so many people, even today, associate England with the dancing plague? Part of the answer lies in the nature of folklore itself. Oral tradition in medieval England was vibrant and fluid. Tales were passed down, modified, exaggerated, and conflated over generations. A minor village festival, a wedding celebration, or a spontaneous outbreak of merriment could morph into a story of compulsion and tragedy over centuries. Human memory is selective and malleable, especially in communities shaped by superstition, famine, and disease. Some scholars have suggested that the English dancing plague may have originated from misread chronicles. Medieval scribes often recorded events with poetic license or symbolic language. A Latin phrase describing villagers moving in frenzy to celebrate a saint's day could, in translation or interpretation, be understood as literal dancing until collapse. Over time, what may have been harmless festivity became a tale of mass hysteria. Another explanation draws from anthropology and medieval ritual practice. England, like the continent, had seasonal festivals, fertility rites, and religious processions where movement and rhythm were integral. Some historians speculate that what we interpret today as a plague may have been ritualized dancing, exaggerated into horror tales by later chroniclers uncomfortable with pagan remnants. In this view, the dancing plague was less a medical or supernatural event, and more a ritual or communal expression misrepresented as catastrophe. But the story refuses to die. Witnesses from later centuries, collectors of folklore, and antiquarians like William Hone and John Brand recorded tales from oral tradition, noting villages where the curse of dance supposedly gripped people until they collapsed. Even in the absence of contemporary documentation, the persistence of these accounts speaks to their cultural power. They capture something deeply human, the fear of losing control over one's body, of being overtaken by forces beyond reason or comprehension. The phenomenon also invites a medical perspective. In Europe, some dancing plagues have been hypothesized as forms of mass psychogenic illness, communities collectively responding to stress, famine, disease, or social tension. Could England have experienced isolated, unrecorded outbreaks of convulsive movement triggered by extreme psychological pressure? Perhaps, perhaps not. Without concrete evidence, the line between speculation and legend blurs. What is undeniable is the imagery the story leaves behind. Imagine a medieval village square at dusk, torches flickering in the mist, shadows dancing wildly across timber-framed houses. Figures leap and spin, their movements relentless, driven by an unseen force. One by one, some collapse exhausted or frightened, while the rest continue, trapped in a rhythm they cannot escape. The air is filled with music, murmurs of awe, and the terrified cries of bystanders. This tableau, though likely fictional, has endured for centuries, painted in woodcuts, later illustrated in pencils, and now rendered in imagination. The tale also reflects medieval anxieties about the body, morality, and divine punishment. Dancing in excess was often seen as a form of indulgence or sin. A village gripped by uncontrollable movement could symbolize the moral and physical vulnerability of human beings. A cautionary tale warning against excess, temptation, or the wrath of God. By the time the story reached collectors of folklore, it had become both entertaining and moralizing, a narrative simultaneously terrifying and instructive. Why then do we continue to speak of the dancing plague in England, despite its absence from primary sources? Perhaps it is because legends persist precisely where documentation fails. The gaps in history invite speculation, imagination, and fear. A story of villagers dancing to death resonates because it embodies universal anxieties, loss of control, communal tragedy, and the thin line between joy and horror. England's imagined plague may tell us less about the physical events of the 14th century, and more about the human need to make sense of the strange and inexplicable. Some modern interpretations embrace a more symbolic understanding. The plague represents the invisible forces that shape human life, social pressure, psychological stress, and cultural expectation. It is a story about how communities respond to crises, how fear spreads like wildfire, and how memory, oral tradition, and imagination preserve events long after the facts have faded. The dancing plague may have never physically occurred in England, but it occurs in the mind, echoing across centuries as a cautionary tale, a puzzle, and a source of fascination. And so, when we look at medieval England, we see a landscape alive with stories, some true, some imagined, all telling us about human fears and desires. The dancing plague that never happened is no exception. It is a mirror reflecting our fascination with the extraordinary, our anxieties about bodies and souls, and the ways in which legend can overtake history. Perhaps the dancing plague never claimed lives in England. Perhaps it was a misread chronicle, a ritual gone wrong, or simply imagination set free. And yet, every time we picture villagers dancing at dusk, relentless, frenzied, and unstoppable, we feel the echo of a story that refuses to die. Along the winding Humber estuary, where the river meets the North Sea, the water has always held secrets. In medieval England, sailors, fishermen, and travelers relied on experience, instinct, and superstition to survive. The Humber is treacherous even today. Shifting tides, hidden sandbanks, and sudden storms could claim lives in moments. But in medieval times, before accurate charts, lighthouses, or weather forecasts, fear and imagination intertwined, and it is here in this liminal space between river and sea that tales of a phantom vessel began to appear. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of a ship with sails furled, lanterns glowing eerily in the fog, drifting silently along the estuary. No one could see a crew aboard, yet it moved as though guided by unseen hands. Some claimed it was the Aus barge, a vessel cursed or trapped between worlds, an omen that disaster was near. The chronicles, sparse and fragmented, describe it not as a ghost in the supernatural sense, but as a warning. The barge appears, wrote one anonymous monk in the 14th century, and those who sail on heedless waters find ruin before the tide turns. The vessel was said to glide across the Humber before great storms, appearing suddenly through mist, then vanishing as quickly as it arrived. To medieval sailors, the ghost ship was as real as the storm itself, a signal to turn back, to seek shelter, to respect the forces they could not command. Fishermen insisted that anyone who ignored the warning of the Aus barge was. Entire crews were said to vanish, ships dashed upon unseen shoals, and nets ripped from hands as if the river itself punished their arrogance. Some chroniclers attempted rational explanations, optical illusions created by moonlight and mist, reflections of distant ships, or even floating debris catching lantern light. But such theories never fully accounted for the terror that gripped the estuary. The stories passed from father to son, from sailor to traveler. Consider the life of a medieval mariner. Each day on the Humber was fraught with danger. Unpredictable tides, sudden fog banks, shifting channels. Navigation was guided by memory, rudimentary maps, and coastal landmarks. Superstition was not just belief, it was survival. Seeing the Aus barge even fleetingly could alter decisions, saving lives or sealing fates. In this sense, the ghost ship served a practical purpose, a story designed to instill caution, reverence, and respect for the river's power. Yet, there was something uncanny in the accounts. Witnesses described details inconsistent with ordinary vessels. Lanterns burned blue or green, not the normal yellow glow of flame. The ship made no sound of rigging, waves, or crew activity, and sometimes it appeared on calm waters where ordinary reflections and mist could not explain it. Some chroniclers speculated it was the spirit of a vessel lost long ago, cursed to drift forever in the estuary. Others imagined that the dead crew bound to their ship wandered in limbo, warning the living of storms and misfortune. The persistence of the story across centuries suggests more than mere folklore. Early modern mariners, writing in the 16th and 17th centuries, still recorded sightings. They noted the same details: lanterns glowing through fog, a silent barge drifting, and a sudden disappearance. Even as navigation improved and maps became more precise, the legend endured. Why? Perhaps because it was not only a story of danger, but also of mystery. A tale where human skill met forces beyond comprehension, and where the line between life and death reality and vision blurred upon the water. Some modern interpretations offer psychological explanations. Fog, reflected moonlight, and atmospheric conditions can create optical illusions, mirages that appear as ships floating above the water or lights dancing across waves. Stress, fatigue, and the constant awareness of danger can amplify perception. Sailors expecting danger, steeped in superstition, may have interpreted natural phenomena as warnings from the Ausbarge. Yet even these explanations fail to capture the profound, lingering fear the ship inspired. Fear, after all, is as much a force as the wind or tide, and in the imagination of those who lived by the water, it had power. The Ausbarge also connects to broader themes in maritime folklore. Across the North Sea and English Channel, phantom ships appear repeatedly in stories. The Flying Dutchman, the ghost ship of the Thames, vessels that sail unseen, crewless and ominous. These tales often appear in areas where the sea is unpredictable and dangerous, places where a single misstep could cost a life. The Humber's ghost ship is part of this continuum, a local manifestation of universal maritime anxieties, yet with a distinctly English flavor. The slow, silty river, the narrow estuary, the moors beyond, and the communities who lived along its banks. Some versions of the tale add a moral dimension. The ship is not merely a warning of physical danger, but a symbol of hubris. Sailors who ignore signs, who defy caution, or who challenge natural order, are punished. In this sense, the Ausbarge is a teaching story as much as a ghost story, a reminder that survival in medieval England required humility as well as skill, respect for forces beyond comprehension, and a careful attention to signs in the natural world. Even today, the legend of the Humber Phantom drifts on. Modern fishermen, local historians, and folklorists recount stories of lights appearing on the water, of vessels glimpsed in fog with no living crew. Photographs and sonar rarely confirm anything, yet the stories endure. They are as much about imagination, history, and the eerie beauty of the Humber estuary as they are about maritime danger. The Ausbarge reminds us that history is not only what is written in chronicles, but what survives in memory, story, and fear, carried across centuries like a ship on fog-bound waters. Imagine standing on the banks of the Humber at dusk. Mist rolls over the water, reflecting the last golden rays of sun. The tide shifts silently. In the distance, a silhouette appears, sails folded, lanterns glowing with an otherworldly light. No sound, no crew. You clutch your coat against the chill and watch as the figure drifts toward the horizon, then fades, leaving only questions, shadows, and a shiver in your spine. That is the Ausbarge. That is the ghost ship of the Humber. Was it a vessel of the dead, a warning carved into folklore, or a trick of mist and fear? Perhaps we will never know, but the Humber remembers, and its phantom ship drifts still, appearing before storms, whispering of danger, and reminding us that some mysteries refuse to sink, even beneath centuries of water and memory. In 1124, in the dense woodlands outside Norwich, a grim discovery shook the medieval city. The body of a young boy, William, was found abandoned, lifeless, and bearing marks of violence. William was only 12 years old, an ordinary child in a world of extraordinary fear. Yet his death would echo far beyond the woodlands, stirring a wave of rumors, suspicion, and hatred that historians remember as one of the darkest and most consequential mysteries of medieval England. At the heart of the mystery lay a question that no contemporary record could answer. How did William die? Some suggested accident, perhaps a fall while playing, perhaps the cruel hand of a criminal. But in a society governed as much by superstition as law, ambiguity quickly gave way to narrative. William's death was attributed not to chance, but to malice, and the accusation fell upon the city's Jewish community. This was not a casual rumor. It was the first recorded instance in Europe of what later became known as the blood libel, the allegation that Jews murdered Christian children in ritual sacrifice. Monks, chroniclers, and clerics amplified the story. Thomas of Monmouth, a monk at Norwich, wrote a detailed account portraying William as a martyr, claimed to have been crucified by Jews in imitation of Christ. These accounts were not grounded in evidence, yet they were persuasive in a society accustomed to religious symbolism and moral allegory. To understand the horror, one must grasp the medieval mindset. England in the 12th century was a place of religious fervor, fear of the unknown, and a fragile social order. Communities were small, closely knit, and vulnerable to economic and spiritual anxiety. The Jewish population, though small, was visible, often prosperous in trade and money lending, and thus an easy target for resentment. When tragedy struck, society sought someone to blame. William's death offered a scapegoat, and the story spread rapidly. Thomas of Monmouth's chronicle is chilling in its detail. He described William as a saintly child, innocent and pure, whose murder was ritualistic and deliberate. According to the text, the boy was abducted, crucified in secret, and buried to conceal the crime. While compelling as narrative, there was never any tangible proof. No witness testified, no body showed evidence of ritual beyond marks that could have come from accidental injury, and no legal proceedings substantiated the accusation. The story was, in essence, a work of imagination, crafted and preserved by those who had both motive and audience. Monks seeking to inspire piety, vilification, and fear. Yet, the tale's impact cannot be overstated. Rumor became precedent. William's death was cited in subsequent anti-Jewish accusations across Europe. Entire communities suffered from suspicion, violence, and persecution. The story illustrates not only the power of narrative, but the vulnerability of society to fear, and how a single, unexplained death could ignite centuries of hatred. Some historians suggest alternative explanations for William's death. Accidental injury is plausible. Children playing near dense woods are prone to falls and misadventure. Criminality unrelated to religion cannot be ruled out. Robbery, personal dispute, or even predatory violence were common in medieval England. Yet, none of these possibilities satisfied the social appetite for meaning. A society steeped in religious symbolism and moral allegory was eager to interpret tragedy as evidence of cosmic or moral conflict. William became more than a child. He became a symbol, a narrative device in a society obsessed with sin, punishment, and divine order. The persistence of the story also speaks to the role of the chronicler. Thomas of Monmouth spent decades writing William's life and death in meticulous detail. He included testimonies, visions, and accounts that reinforced the boy's sanctity and the malevolence of his alleged murderers. While modern readers can see the lack of evidence and the bias in the narrative, medieval audiences were not equipped with skeptical frameworks. In a world governed by faith, ritual, and moral lessons, Thomas's work carried authority, shaping collective memory. The consequences for Norwich's Jewish population were catastrophic. Accusations of ritual murder, even without proof, fueled hostility. They exacerbated pre-existing tensions, leading to economic restrictions, social ostracism, and in some cases violence. William's story became a tool, consciously or unconsciously, to justify discrimination. It is a stark reminder that in medieval societies, storytelling was not only entertainment or moral guidance, but could wield deadly influence. Yet, beyond the politics and prejudice, there is the human story, a child lost, a community unsettled, and a mystery that defies resolution. William of Norwich's fate is unknown. Was he a victim of accident, of crime, or of invention? We may never know. What remains is not the certainty of his death's circumstances, but the shadows it cast across medieval England, shaping memory, belief, and fear. The case also raises questions about historical evidence, narrative, and perception. Chronicles like Thomas of Monmouth's are invaluable for understanding medieval thought, yet they illustrate the danger of assuming that written record equates to fact. Medieval history is often a blend of observation, interpretation, and imagination. In William's story, this mixture becomes tragically clear. Fact, rumor, and moralized invention combine to produce a narrative that survives, even when the truth does not. Walking through modern Norwich, one can still feel echoes of the past. The woodlands where William's body was found are quiet, overgrown, and seemingly ordinary. Yet the air is heavy with stories carried across centuries, stories of innocence exploited, fear manipulated, and communities divided. The mystery is no longer about proving guilt, but about understanding the human tendency to seek explanation, to craft meaning, and sometimes to direct blame toward the most vulnerable. In this way, William's story resonates beyond Norwich, beyond the 12th century, beyond England. It is a tale of how societies construct narratives around tragedy, how rumor becomes belief, and how fear can transform a child's death into a tool for moral instruction or, tragically, persecution. William becomes both historical figure and symbol, his life, death, and the stories told about him a mirror, reflecting the anxieties, prejudices, and storytelling culture of medieval Europe. Was William's death an accident, a crime, or invention? We cannot say. What remains is a story of fear, of imagination wielded as power, and of a child whose memory was used to justify hatred. In the shadowed woodlands of Norwich, his story lingers, a reminder that history is never neutral, that every tale carries both truth and consequence, and that the line between fact and legend is often as fragile as life itself. Along the wind-swept border of Oxfordshire, near the gentle rise of the Cotswolds, stand the roll-right stones, a ring of weathered monoliths that have watched over the land for millennia. By the time of medieval England, these stones were not merely relics, they were legends in their own right. To the local villagers, the circle was imbued with stories, superstition, and most haunting of all, the whispering of soldiers who had been turned to stone. The section known as the Whispering Knights was said to mark the fallen of a great battle. According to folklore, these were soldiers caught in betrayal, frozen in time for their treachery, yet cursed to speak eternally. By day they were silent and unmoving, weathered by wind and rain, but at night, or in the chill before dawn, villagers swore they heard whispers carried on the wind, plotting, murmuring, recounting deeds long past, as if the stone itself remembered. Medieval chroniclers occasionally referenced the stones, recording tales of travelers and pilgrims who had paused at Rollright and returned with stories of uncanny voices. These were not casual murmurs of the wind through grass. Witnesses described hearing coherent words, as if soldiers long dead debated tactics, curses, or the betrayals that led to their petrification. One account, written in the 13th century, tells of a farmer who camped near the stones and claimed to hear low chanting voices rising and falling like a conversation in an invisible hall. Why would the people of medieval England believe in whispering stones? The answer lies partly in the intersection of landscape history and imagination. Ancient monuments were mysterious, their true origins long forgotten. Villagers observed that the stones predated their memory, were aligned strangely to the horizon, and bore marks weathered by centuries. It was natural in a culture attuned to signs, omens, and curses to believe that powerful events had left imprints, that stones could preserve memories of human deeds, especially acts of violence, treachery, or heroism. The folklore surrounding the Whispering Knights also reflects the moral imagination of medieval England. Soldiers frozen in stone for betrayal became cautionary symbols. Stories emphasized loyalty, honor, and the consequences of treachery. They served a dual purpose, preserving cultural memory and enforcing social values. In an era when oral storytelling was primary, legends like this circulated widely, warning travelers, entertaining villagers, and explaining the inexplicable presence of enigmatic stone circles in familiar landscape. Modern folklore enthusiasts often explore the possibility of natural explanations for the whispers. Wind patterns, the resonance of the stone, and the acoustics of the surrounding hills could create eerie, murmuring sounds. At certain angles, gusts might travel through gaps in the stone circle, producing low tones that suggest conversation. But such scientific explanations do little to diminish the medieval experience. For a traveler in the 12th or 13th century, hearing voices where no lips moved would be terrifying, sacred, and deeply mysterious. Some accounts describe pilgrims attempting to speak to the stones to interrogate the knight's whispers. In several recorded cases, the stones seemed to respond a shift in tone, a soft echo, or a perceived change in pitch, as though answering questions with cryptic advice. The interpretation of these events often reflected the listener's fears, desires, or guilt. Medieval society was intensely symbolic. Every strange sound or vision was a potential message from God, the dead, or the supernatural. The Whispering Knights, petrified yet audible, occupied a liminal space between natural and supernatural, past and present. The location of Rollright stones contributed to their mystique. On high ground overlooking valleys and ancient tracks, the site was isolated. Travelers passing after dusk could hear the wind sweeping through fields, rattling low branches and striking the stones in ways that intensified the imagination. Fog often draped the landscape, muffling ordinary sounds and amplifying the strain. To medieval ears attuned to meaning in natural events, these conditions were perfect for interpreting ordinary phenomena as messages, warnings, or evidence of lingering spirit. Legends also suggest that the knights were not merely silent observers but active participants in the human world. Villagers claimed that the stones could curse, bless, or forewarn. A merchant who disrespected the circle might later encounter misfortune. A knight passing nearby might hear whispers that seemed to guide, to challenge, or to remind him of honor long forgotten. The stories of the whispering knights then were dynamic, living narratives evolving over generations, absorbing the anxieties, morality, and hopes of the communities around them. The persistence of the legend across centuries is remarkable. Even after the medieval period, travelers, antiquarians, and folklorists reported hearing whispers or sensations near the stones. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the rollright stones had become sites of both scholarly interest and spiritual fascination, with writers and poets describing the frozen nights and their eternal murmuring. Some interpreted the whispers as protective, others as ominous, reinforcing the idea that the site held power beyond the physical. The whispering nights also reflect a broader medieval fascination with liminality, spaces and moments on the threshold between life and death, seen and unseen, ordinary and magical. Stone circles, forests, and remote hills were often perceived as thresholds capable of holding memories of past events, spirits, and curses. The Knights of Rollright became a tangible embodiment of this belief, soldiers of history, caught between mortality and eternity, whose voices might reach those willing to listen. Imagine for a moment walking through the rollright stones as dusk falls. The stones rise from the earth, jagged and weathered, casting long shadows across uneven grass. The air chills, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. A traveler pauses, listening. In the silence there is sound, not of animals, not of wind, but something else. Low murmurs, almost coherent, rising and falling like conversation. No lips move, no living being is present, yet the impression of plotting, debate, and ancient memory fills the mind. Could the stones remember? Could they speak? In the medieval imagination they did, and still do. The Whispering Knights invite reflection on the nature of memory, storytelling, and history. Are the voices purely imagined products of suggestion, fear, or expectation? Or do they symbolize something deeper, the human impulse to preserve acts of courage, betrayal, or tragedy in the landscape itself? Medieval England was a world where the seen and unseen coexisted, where morality, narrative, and the natural environment. The Knights' whispers are as much a mirror of human culture as a mystery of the stones themselves. Were they merely stones shaped by wind and time, or soldiers frozen mid-betrayal, whispering secrets across centuries? Perhaps the answer lies not in what we hear but in what we believe. The Whispering Knights remind us that in medieval England, even stones can carry stories of honor, treachery, fear, and memory, waiting for the traveler willing to listen.
Of all England's medieval monarchs, King John is remembered less for what he built and more for what he lost. And in 1216, he lost something so spectacular that people are still digging for it. I'm speaking, of course, about the treasure of King John, a royal hoard that vanished beneath the mud of the Wash. In the autumn of 1216, John was not having the best of years. The French were invading, his nobles had rebelled, and his health was failing. To make matters worse, he had a rather awkward problem. He needed to cross the Wash, a wide and treacherous estuary in East Anglia, with the full baggage train of the royal household. The Wash is a landscape of tidal rivers, shifting sands, and sudden floods. If you mistime the crossing by even an hour, the sea rushes in like a thief, swallowing anything left behind. And that is precisely what happened. John himself took the safer land route, but he sent his carts, wagons, and baggage through the marsh. The convoy included gold and silver plate, precious relics, the royal regalia, even the crown jewels of England. Chroniclers claim whole wagons sank without a trace. By the time John reached the far side, the treasure had disappeared beneath the mud. A week later, John himself died, dysentery they say, and the treasure has never been recovered. For centuries, rumors swirled. Some believe the treasure is still buried under the shifting sands of the Wash, preserved like a hoard of pirates' gold. Others suggested opportunistic locals plundered it before the tides rolled in. And then there's the romantic version, that the treasure was never lost at all, but quietly hidden away, and that its discovery might still wait in a farmer's field or a forgotten vault. Historians have tried to make sense of the story. Some argue John's baggage wasn't as magnificent as chroniclers made it sound. Perhaps he lost not the crown jewels but only his household silver, a few relics, and ceremonial objects. After all, chroniclers enjoyed painting John as cursed, incompetent, or unlucky. What better symbol of his doomed reign than watching his wealth sink into the sea? Yet treasure hunters still head to the wash with metal detectors, convinced that something glittering lies just beneath the mudflats. But here's the curious part. Not a single coin, relic, or crown has ever been found. And so the wash keeps its secret. Was it swallowed whole by the tide, carried out to sea, or quietly pocketed by those who lived nearby? No one can say. What we can say is this: King John entered the wash with wealth fit for a king, and left with nothing but legend.